Later this week sees the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, VJ Day, as we call it, Victory in Japan. And I suspect that our national celebrations are going to be quite muted, as they were in May when we didn't celebrate VE Day. Back in May, I was talking to my dad about VE Day because he was there at Buckingham Palace in all those crowds. My granddad had taken him there and sat him on his shoulders, and I asked him where in the crowd he was. I was hoping that I might be able to pick him out from one of the photographs, but he reminded me that he was only 3. Why do I mention that? Well, the passage that we read, the first reading in Paul's letter to the Romans, speaks of, well, it ends, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And Paul is quoting from the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah is in turn talking about the messengers that would have been in those days who brought news from the battlefield, that the battle had been won, or maybe that the war had been won, and how those messages of victory were received, how beautiful. Even their feet seemed beautiful when they came in. How was it for the wireless operator or the radio operator who told people back in London and Washington and Moscow that Japan had surrendered and that World War II was over? How well was that news received? Paul says that the way that people receive messages from battle is how the joy of it is just like how people should receive the good news that Jesus proclaimed. Now, this morning we're going to talk about telling our God stories, and sadly when we tell our God stories, those nuggets from our lives about why God is important to us and the difference that he's made, why those God stories are sometimes not received as good news with joy, and how in this passage from Paul there are little hints about how we can maybe do that better, tell our God stories in a better way. Now, I've deliberately chosen to sit in this seat and speak today. I'm living in this seat. I'm a home worker during the COVID lockdown, and for the last 3 or 4 months my life has been in these 4 walls, and this is the place where I do my work every day. And a lot of that work is on video conferencing, and I get quite a lot of remarks about all these books behind me. Have you read all of those? You've got a lot of books, and what are they about? And I tell them that they're books mostly on theology. You'll see some maps there as well, but they're mostly books that help me with my sermons and my general encounter with God. And they say, you can't have read them all. And I say, well, yeah, I haven't read them all, but I've read most of them. And why do I mention that? Well, books can get in the way. The message that Paul proclaims in this passage is that the gospel message is remarkably simple. Let me read what Paul says. Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Just 2 things. Believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. And yet we make it so complicated. There's so much stuff in these books, and it's all relevant, but in essence God's message is really simple. Just those 2 things about belief and confession about Jesus and God raising him from the dead. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all this learning and knowledge isn't important, but it does depend on the point where you are with God, where your relationship is. God has immeasurable depth, and the more that we get to know Him, the more we encounter Him, the more depth and beauty we see, and the more that things in these books might be useful to us in that journey of growth and knowledge. But they're not needed to start the journey. We can all start to get to know Him. We can all discover that He's God. And it doesn't matter what sort of person or capabilities we have. The message that if we confess Jesus as Lord and believe in our heart that God raised Him from the dead is a tremendous leveller. Paul says that it's the same for Jews and for Greeks. In the modern context, we might say it doesn't matter what our intellect is like, whether we're naturally loving or kind, whether we're good people or not, whether we're attractive, whether we go to church, what disabilities we suffer, what life has thrown at us. All these things are irrelevant to that message that Paul gives. All we need to be able to do to tell God stories that work is to speak of our own experience. We mustn't make them too complicated, and we mustn't be scared or overawed about telling them just because we know that there's more depth behind what God has revealed. It's not the bookcase that's important, it's the person in front of it. Another thing that we need to realise is the hidden depth in these two things that Paul highlights for us, because it points to a way of living that draws us into an ever deeper relationship with God as our Heavenly Father. It doesn't matter with which of the two things you choose to start, God can work with either. If we make Jesus Lord of some part of our lives, my experience is that our belief grows deeper. And when my belief grows deeper, I'm able to make Jesus Lord in other parts of my life. And then it continues in a virtuous circle. Make Jesus Lord, believe deeper, make Jesus Lord. And so we grow in that relationship with God. And why do I mention that here in the context of telling our God stories? Well, the message that we proclaim to people is far more than the words that come out of our mouths. Psychologists tell us that only a very small proportion of communication is oral or verbal. What do our lives say about the extent to which we've made Jesus Lord? What do they say about the inner, unseen relationship that we enjoy with God? When people look at us, will they see Jesus as Lord of our money? Jesus is Lord of our time, our passions, our politics, our energy. Who's the boss in our lives? And will they see love? Will they see the love that God empowers us with? Do we emanate a sense of peace? If not, we shouldn't be discouraged, because that virtuous circle is the solution. We just need to go to God and pray about it. Let Jesus be Lord of some aspect of our lives, and let God work that holy magic in us. But they're powerful things, these. People will see right to what we stand for, and that will speak really strongly of the good news that we're proclaiming. This was true for me some years ago when I was a student, and a friend of mine and I used to talk regularly about theological matters, about why I was a Christian and he was an atheist. I thought we were discussing theology and belief. And years later, when he became a Christian and told me that those conversations had been important, it turned out that what I thought was important, the things that we were discussing, were nothing of the sort. What was really important to that man was the contentment that I had with life, the certainty that despite my scientific education, I saw Jesus as Lord of my science. That somehow, despite myself, God was somehow shining through me. And it was the unspoken, non-verbal part of my God story that really made an impact on him. So our God stories are much more than words, and we need to make Jesus Lord of all parts of our lives. Another piece of the jigsaw that I want to draw out to us is a different focus on those two statements. That if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Our eyes are, well, mine anyway, are drawn quite naturally to this Jesus is Lord and believing that he was raised from the dead, whereas probably our focus should be on the other ends of those sentences. The need to confess and the need to believe in our hearts. Confess it's a strong word, isn't it? It's more than speaking or saying. Think about when you own up to something, when you confess to something. I think you can only confess something if you are coming at it from a position of humility or vulnerability. It's a deep way of speaking. And belief, well, it's not just a fact remembered or an inkling of the truth that Paul's talking about. Paul says we need to believe these things in our heart, believe them to the core of our being. These are relationship words. We are shaped by God from the inside out. Think for a minute about politicians and whether we believe what they say or not. They get a bad press, and they're having a very bad press at the moment in the COVID crisis. I'm not going to say anything particular because I will distract you from my message. I'll go back to World War II. I'll go back to Churchill. Why was it that people believed what Churchill said, and he ended with such a good reputation when so many politicians don't? And I think the phrase we sometimes use is that he was a conviction politician. He spoke from the heart, sometimes off script, about what he believed. And that's true for us too. We need to be careful on the ground we walk. We need to be caring of how our message will be received, but we need to speak from the heart, because our God stories are God stories about the relationship we have with God. And if we make them too factual, too intellectual, they won't carry. It's about that relationship. Our stories will be convincing if we can talk about the difference that the relationship that we enjoy with God makes in our lives. Well, that's quite a bit of theory about what our God's stories might look like, I think a practical example would help. And to do that, I'm going to imagine what sort of God story Peter might have told from that night when Jesus walked on the water. So it's a bit of a, have to use our imaginations, but let's imagine Peter telling someone years later about that night. So there we were, rowing across the lake, and as you know, I've seen some mighty storms down the years, and this one was starting to concern me, starting to look a bit like a blower. And just as I was getting a little concerned for me and for the lads, whether we should turn back, Jesus appears, bold as you like, just walking across the lake. Walking. Well, I thought I'd seen it all those miracles that he brought about, all those healings earlier that day when he fed thousands of people with just a few loaves and fishes. But walking on water, that just about took the biscuit. Well, I don't know what possessed me, but I called out and asked him if I could have a go as well. And when I stepped out, well, I was walking too. Me, Simon, son of Jonah, walking on water. But then, big mistake. I looked down. I think I might have sworn at that point as I started sinking, but he grabbed me. And yes, he took the mickey out of me, but I was back walking on water soon enough. And that's how it always is with him. Yes, I've had my sticky moments, but whenever I've trusted Jesus, whenever I've made him my Lord, whenever I've taken God's side of things, and that sometimes has meant risking my life, God has always saved me. Every single time. And I've grown to know that Jesus is my Lord and believe deep down that God will always save me. Now, our own God stories aren't going to be probably as exciting as Peter's. We won't have seen miracles, meals appearing from nowhere, walking on water, but there will be times in our lives when God has acted and we are his witnesses. There'll be times when what got us through was believing in him, when knowing or declaring that Jesus is our Lord was the answer. And if we can do that with our God stories, include those two bits, speak of our belief in our hearts and declare that Jesus is Lord of our lives, we won't go too far wrong with our God stories. So in telling our God stories to people, we are proclaiming victory. We're proclaiming a victory that isn't complicated. So we should keep our God stories simple, and we should not be scared to tell them. We should not be overawed by the fact that there's more depth beneath us than we need to talk at first. It's a victory for all people and for all parts of our lives. So in telling our God stories, we need to let that victory shine out from us. Show Jesus as Lord to people in all aspects of our lives, remembering that These things are far more powerful than our words can ever be. And it's a victory won deep in hearts through an intimate relationship. So when we tell people our God stories, when we tell people about those times when God was the difference that got us through, we need to show something in the story of how it was the belief in our hearts and the confession of Jesus as Lord that shone. Because they're the hooks that God can start using as his ingredients to work in the lives of other people. So what might our own God stories be like? They should be stories of victory, told in a way that's received by people as good news, something beautiful, something lovely, something compelling, something that causes people to do what my granddad did and run to the palace. Let's listen to those words again from Paul. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Amen.